Welcome back to the Scary Collector. If you're new here, you may want to reconsider pressing play. Not because we exaggerate, not because we sensationalize, but because everything you are about to hear is real. Real people, real events, real horror that unfolded in living rooms, quiet neighborhoods, church basements, and online chat rooms. Tonight, we have collected 6 stories for you. 6 cases that, once you hear them, you will never fully shake from your mind. We are talking about cults that twisted the minds of thousands. Killers who wore masks of normalcy so convincing that even their families never saw it coming. And stalkers, perhaps the most chilling of all, because a stalker is someone who looked at another human being and decided that person belonged to them. Make sure you are somewhere comfortable. Maybe lock your door. Turn on a light or 2 if you need to, because the darkness in these stories doesn't stay on the screen. Let's begin. Story 1. The Family, the Cult That Called Itself Love. In the early 1960s, in the rolling hills of rural Australia, a man named Anne Hamilton-Byrne was building something. He called it a spiritual family. He called it love. He called it the path to enlightenment. His followers called him the Master. But the children who were stolen, purchased, and chemically manipulated to believe this man was the literal second coming of Jesus Christ, they called him something far simpler. They called him Mum. And Hamilton-Byrne was born Evelyn Grace Victoria Edwards in 1921 in Victoria, Australia. By most accounts, his early life was marked by trauma. His mother was institutionalized, his childhood unstable. But somewhere along the way, that trauma curdled into something else. Something calculating. By the late 1950s, Hamilton-Byrne had discovered yoga. He discovered meditation. He discovered that people in pain are looking for someone to tell them the pain has a purpose. And he discovered that he was very, very good at being that person. He began leading classes in yoga in Melbourne. And the people who came to those classes weren't just looking for flexibility. They were looking for meaning. They were nurses, doctors, lawyers, educated, professional people who felt a void, and Hamilton-Byrne had figured out exactly how to fill it. He told them he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. He told them he remembered his past lives. He told them that he and his followers had been together before, in ancient Egypt in biblical times, and that they had been gathered again in this lifetime for a sacred purpose. And people believed him. The group grew slowly at first. They called themselves the Family. Officially, they were affiliated with a yoga-based spiritual movement called Santiniketan Park Association. But beneath the pleasant name, beneath the yoga mats and the meditation music, something far darker was taking shape. Hamilton-Byrne began acquiring children. Some were born to followers who were told to hand over their babies as a spiritual offering. Some were born to single mothers who were told that giving their child to the family was the greatest gift they could give. Some were adopted through fraudulent paperwork, using followers who were doctors or nurses to falsify birth certificates, listing Hamilton-Byrne as the biological mother. Over the years, he accumulated at least 14 children, possibly more, and each child was given the surname Hamilton-Byrne. Each child was dressed identically, and each child's hair was bleached the same platinum blonde. Hamilton-Byrne wanted them to look like his children. He wanted them to look like him because he claimed to be divine, and divinity, he believed, looked like pale skin and white blonde hair. These children were raised in near-total isolation on a compound called Uptop, a remote property in the hills northeast of Melbourne. They were homeschooled by followers. They were forbidden from speaking to outsiders. They were taught that the outside world was dangerous, corrupt, and spiritually inferior. They were told that Hamilton-Byrne was their biological mother, and that he was the Messiah. They were told that when the apocalypse came, and it was coming soon, only they would survive. One of those children was a woman named Sarah Moore. She was one of the 14 children raised at Uptop, and years later, after the cult was finally raided and she was able to rebuild her life, she wrote a book about what she had experienced. She described mealtimes where children were forced to eat until they vomited, and then ordered to eat the vomit. She described being punished for infractions by being locked in a dark room. She described being given drugs, specifically a powerful psychedelic called LSD, without her knowledge or consent. The children were told the experience was a spiritual initiation. They were not told what they had been given. She described the overseer's older female followers called the aunties, who ran the compound with a mixture of religious devotion and casual cruelty. And she described Hamilton-Byrne himself, the serene, white-robed figure who would descend on the compound periodically, who would stroke their hair and tell them they were blessed. She also described the terror of believing, for years, that what was happening to her was normal, that this was simply what love looked like. Because that is what cults do. They don't come at you screaming. They come at you whispering. They come at you with warmth and belonging and the promise that you are special, that you have been chosen. And then, slowly, quietly, they take everything. They take your past. They rewrite your history. They take your relationships. They isolate you from anyone who might question what you're being told. They take your body, your autonomy, your sense of what is real. And if you are a child, if you have never known anything else, you don't even know what has been stolen, because you don't know what you were supposed to have. The raid on the family compound finally came in August of 1987. Victoria Police, acting on information from former members who had managed to leave and speak out, raided Uptop and removed 6 children from the property. The children were malnourished. Their hair, as always, was bleached white. They had never attended a regular school. They had never seen a television. They had never walked into a grocery store. And Hamilton-Byrne was not at the compound during the raid. He had been tipped off. He fled the country with his partner William Byrne, moving through Europe and eventually settling for a time in the United Kingdom. It would take nearly a decade for authorities to catch up with him. In 1993, Anne Hamilton-Byrne was arrested in New York. He was extradited to Australia and charged, not with child abuse, not with the administration of drugs, not with the psychological torture of children. The charges ultimately were fraud-related. False documentation, falsified birth certificates. He was fined, not imprisoned, fined. He died in 2019 at the age of 97, in a nursing home, reportedly suffering from dementia in his final years. By the time he died, he had reportedly forgotten almost everything. The children he raised remember everything. The cult, the family, no longer exists as an active organization. But the damage it did continues. The 14 children who were raised within it have spent their adult lives working to understand what was done to them, to rebuild identities that were systematically dismantled before they were even old enough to understand what an identity was. Some of them have spoken publicly. Some have written. Some remain silent. And perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire story, more disturbing than the compound, more disturbing than the bleached hair and the matching dresses and the LSD administered to children in the name of spiritual growth, is this: the followers who enabled all of it, who handed over their babies, who served as aunties and administered punishment, who falsified documents and kept secrets for decades. Most of them never faced criminal charges. Most of them quietly moved on with their lives. And some of them, even today, still believe Anne Hamilton-Byrne was exactly what he said he was. That is the power of a cult. That is the power of a man who learned very early on that the most effective cage you can build around a person isn't made of iron bars. It's made of belief. Story 2. The neighbor who watched, a stalker's obsession. There is a particular kind of fear that comes with being watched. Not the fear of a horror movie monster. Not the fear of a dark alley or a sudden loud noise. It's quieter than that. More patient. It seeps in slowly, the slight wrongness of something moved in your home, the car you've seen parked in the same spot 3 days in a row, the feeling, impossible to explain to someone who hasn't felt it, that the air has been disturbed in your personal space. That feeling is the warning. Most people dismiss it. This is the story of a woman we'll call Marina. Names have been changed in this account to protect her privacy. The events are documented, the details verified. Marina was in her late 20s when she moved into a quiet apartment building in a mid-sized European city. She was single, newly employed at a hospital where she worked as a radiologist, and looking forward to a fresh start in a new neighborhood. The building seemed ideal. Clean hallways, good security, friendly management, and her neighbor across the hall, an older man, perhaps 60, who introduced himself as Tomas, seemed the kind of person who would keep to himself. He knocked on her door within 2 days of her moving in. He brought cookies. He said he liked to welcome new neighbors. He was polite, slightly formal. Marina thanked him, ate one cookie, and thought nothing more of it. The first sign came about 3 weeks later. She came home from a night shift to find a small bouquet of flowers on her doorstep. No card. She assumed they had been left for the wrong apartment and moved on. The second sign came a week after that. She mentioned in passing, in the elevator, to Tomas, that she had been having trouble sleeping. It was the kind of small talk you make with a neighbor you don't know well. You say something inconsequential. You fill the silence. The following day, she found a small package outside her door. A bottle of chamomile tea and a handwritten note that said, "For sleep. Tea." Marina felt uncomfortable. Not alarmed, not yet, but uncomfortable. She told herself it was thoughtful. She told herself he was probably just a lonely old man. She told herself she was being uncharitable. This is something we do. When someone's behavior unsettles us and we can't quite point to the specific rule they've broken, we doubt ourselves. We call ourselves paranoid. We tell ourselves we're overreacting. She thanked him briefly when she saw him in the hall. She did not encourage further conversation. The small gestures continued. A newspaper left outside her door. A note saying he'd seen her light on late and hoped she was all right. Once, a handwritten letter, 2 pages, about the neighborhood, about local restaurants, about his life before he had moved to the city. Marina did not respond to the letter. And then the behavior shifted. She noticed that he seemed to know her schedule. If she left for work at 7, he would emerge from his apartment, ostensibly to collect his newspaper, at 6:58. If she returned home at 7 in the evening, he would be in the lobby, ostensibly checking his mailbox. It happened too consistently to be coincidence. But how was he tracking her schedule? Her building had a security camera in the lobby. Only management had access to the footage. And yet, she began varying her schedule, leaving at different times, coming home through the back entrance when possible. He adapted. One evening, sitting on her balcony, her apartment was on the 4th floor. She looked down at the street below and saw a figure, standing at the edge of the opposite pavement, looking up. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she saw the posture, the stillness, the particular quality of someone who is looking at a specific window. She went inside. She didn't sleep that night. The following day, she spoke to the building manager and asked about the security footage. Had anyone accessed the system recently? Was there a log of viewings? The manager seemed confused. He told her that only maintenance had been in the security room recently to fix a faulty sensor. And then he mentioned, because he thought it might be helpful, that one of the residents had actually assisted with that maintenance call. a retired engineer who knew the building's systems well. He gave her the man's apartment number. It was Tomas. Marina went to the police. She explained everything. The gifts, the letters, the synchronized schedule, the figure in the street, the security system. The officer who took her report was sympathetic but honest. He told her that what she was describing was concerning, but that without direct threats, without physical contact, without evidence of criminal trespass, there was very little they could do at this stage. He advised her to document everything, to keep a log with dates and times, to install her own security camera inside her apartment door. She did all of that. Over the next 6 weeks, she documented 47 separate incidents. The frequency was increasing. The nature was changing. She found her name written on a piece of paper slipped under her door. Just her name, nothing else. She found her doormat had been moved, repeatedly, to face a specific direction. Once, she came home to find that the small potted plant she kept outside her door had been watered. She hadn't watered it in 3 days. Someone had. And then one night at 2:17 in the morning, she heard something. A sound just outside her door. Not a knock. Not footsteps. A sound she described later as someone breathing, slow, deliberate, very close to the door. She looked through the peephole. Tomas was standing in the hallway, in his dressing gown, his hands at his sides, his face tilted slightly downward, toward the gap at the bottom of her door. He stood there for 11 minutes. She timed it. He did not knock. He did not speak. He simply stood there. And then he went back to his apartment. Marina called the police immediately. This time, with the documented log, with the security footage from her own camera showing his silhouette in the hallway, with the evidence she had carefully compiled over 6 weeks, the police had enough to act. Tomas was arrested the following morning. When officers searched his apartment, they found something that made even the most experienced investigators pause. One wall of his bedroom, an entire wall, was covered in photographs of Marina, taken through her window, taken in the lobby, taken in the street outside her hospital, taken on her balcony, from below. He had a journal. It ran to nearly 400 pages. It was written in the second person, addressed directly to Marina, as though she were reading it. It described his love for her in language that was, in turns, tender, possessive, and disturbing. It described in clinical detail her routines, her habits, the expression on her face when she checked her mailbox and didn't find anything interesting. He had noted the color of her work bag on different days. He had noted when she changed her hairstyle. He had recorded every time she had smiled, at anyone, for any reason. He had planned, according to several journal entries, to introduce himself more formally when the time was right. He was waiting, he wrote, for Marina to understand. He believed sincerely, completely, that she was already in love with him, that her silence and her avoidance were simply her way of being coy, of making him wait. He wrote that he respected her for that. He wrote, "She is teaching me patience. That is what love is." Tomas was charged with stalking and criminal surveillance. He received a suspended sentence and a restraining order. He was required to attend psychiatric evaluation. Marina moved out of the building before his case even went to court. When she spoke about the experience afterward, in a brief, anonymous account shared with a victims' advocacy organization, she said the most difficult part was not the fear, not the sleepless nights, not even the sight of him standing outside her door. The most difficult part, she said, was how long it took her to trust her own instincts. How many times she told herself she was imagining things. How many times she made herself smaller, quieter, less present. Tried to take up less space in her own life, to avoid upsetting a man she barely knew. She said, I had spent so long trying not to hurt his feelings that I forgot to protect my own safety. And when I finally gave myself permission to be afraid, when I finally said, out loud, "This is not normal, this is not acceptable," that was the moment things started to change. Trust your instincts. Document everything. And never apologize for protecting yourself. Those are the only 3 rules you need. Story 3. The Order of the Solar Temple. Death in the Name of the Stars. What would it take to convince you to die? Not to risk your life, not to stand in front of danger for someone you love, but to actually choose death. To believe so completely and so profoundly that death is not an ending but a beginning, that you would drink a poison, or accept an injection, or walk into a burning building. Not with anguish but with serenity. That is what the Order of the Solar Temple asked of its followers. And they said yes. The Order of the Solar Temple, in French, L'Ordre du Temple Solaire, was a secret society founded in 1984 in Geneva, Switzerland. Its founders were Joseph D. Mambro and Luc Juret. D. Mambro was a jeweler and occultist with a long history of involvement in esoteric groups and a talent for financial manipulation. Juret was a homeopathic doctor, charismatic, well-spoken, with the kind of calm authority that makes people feel safe. Together, they built something extraordinary. The order drew heavily on the mythology of the Knights Templar, the medieval crusading order that had been dissolved in the 14th century under accusations of heresy. D. Mambro and Juret told their followers that they were the true heirs of that tradition, that they carried ancient wisdom, that they were, spiritually speaking, the most important people alive. The followers were not the kind of people you might expect to fall for this. They were doctors, architects, business executives, police officers, prominent citizens of Switzerland, France, Canada. These were educated, successful, skeptical people, the kind of people who would tell you, if you asked, that they were far too sensible to be deceived by a cult. And yet, D. Mambro and Juret understood something that most people don't. Intelligence and education are not protection against this kind of manipulation. If anything, they can make you more vulnerable. Because intelligent people believe they cannot be fooled, and that belief makes them easier to fool. You don't waste time convincing a skeptic that something is real. You make them feel that they, uniquely, are smart enough to see what others cannot. You flatter their discernment. You give them something complex, rituals, symbols, hierarchies, and you make mastery of that complexity a mark of status. The order did all of this beautifully. Initiates went through elaborate degrees of membership, each with its own ceremonies and secrets. At the highest levels, they were told the deepest truths. That the earth was doomed, that humanity was incapable of spiritual evolution, and that the only path forward was what D. Mambro called the transit. A passage, through death, to a higher plane of existence beyond the physical world. Members were told that their physical bodies were simply vessels, that what they really were, their true selves, existed at a cosmic level that transcended ordinary human existence. They were told that to die in the right way, in the right state of consciousness, was not to die at all. It was to graduate. On the night of October 4th, 1994, in the Swiss village of Cherry, a farmhouse burned. When firefighters arrived and managed to get inside, they found the bodies of 23 people arranged in a circle. Each body was dressed in ceremonial robes, red, gold, black. Each person had been shot or poisoned or both. Some showed evidence of having received injections. Some had plastic bags over their heads. In the hours that followed, police received reports of 2 more fires at chalets in the Swiss village of Granges-sur-Salvan. 25 more bodies were found. Same robes, same arrangement. And in Quebec, Canada, in the small village of Morin Heights, police were called to a burning property and found 4 more bodies, including a 3-month-old baby. The infant had been killed separately from the adults. The baby, according to later investigation, had been stabbed because DiMambro had declared, to his inner circle, that the child was the Antichrist. 48 people died that night in October of 1994. It did not end there. In December of 1995, 16 more members of the order were found dead in a forest in the French Alps. The bodies were arranged in a star pattern. This time, some of the victims were children. 3 children, between the ages of 2 and 12. And in March of 1997, 5 more people died in a fire in Saint-Casimir, Quebec. In total, 74 people died in the mass deaths associated with the Order of the Solar Temple. Investigators who pieced together what had happened described a complex picture. Some victims, it appeared, had participated willingly in the transit. They believed they were ascending. They had written farewell letters to family members, calm, even joyful letters that spoke of moving on to a better existence. Others had not participated willingly. Some had been drugged without their knowledge. Some had been shot or injected by other members. Some, investigators believed, had tried to resist. Among those who died in the October 1994 events were DiMambro himself, the founder, and Luc Juret. They had chosen to go with their followers, or had arranged it so they had no choice. It was never entirely clear. What was clear was that by the time the final fires were set, something had gone deeply wrong within the order even by its own standards. DiMambro had been exposed as a fraud by some of his closest lieutenants. The cosmic messages he claimed to channel from ancient masters had been revealed to be produced by hidden electronic equipment. The man who claimed to channel the divine was using audio and lighting rigs concealed in secret rooms. When some members began to question, began to doubt, the response was not to rebuild trust. It was to accelerate the plan. The transit could not be delayed. What do we make of this? There is an easy, comfortable answer. That the followers were weak or naive or mentally unwell. That they were not like us. That this could not happen to people we know. To people like us. But the records don't support that comfort. The people who died in the forests and the burning farmhouses of Switzerland and France and Canada were, by every measurable standard, ordinary human beings. Many of them were successful. Many of them were educated. Many of them had friends and families outside the order who described them as intelligent, warm, grounded people. They were people who were looking for meaning, who wanted to believe that the universe had a structure, that there was a reason for suffering, a framework for existence, a destination beyond the chaos. And 2 men, one a jeweler with a talent for theater, one a doctor with an authority and charisma, told them they had found it. The Order of the Solar Temple is not the longest-running cult in history. It is not the largest. It did not produce the most victims in raw numbers of any dangerous group. But it stands as perhaps the most complete illustration of where the logic of a certain kind of belief, taken to its furthest conclusion, can lead. Once you have convinced someone that the physical world is an illusion, that the real world is somewhere else, that death is just a door, then death loses its power as a deterrent. It becomes, instead, the point. And that is the most terrifying kind of power any human being can have over another. Not the power to make someone do something terrible. The power to make them want to. Story 4. The Man in the Walls. A killer hiding in plain sight. There is a category of crime so extreme, so incomprehensible, that even the investigators who handle it sometimes struggle to articulate the experience. Not because the facts are unclear, but because the facts, laid out plainly, seem to resist comprehension. The mind slides off them. It keeps trying to find an angle at which they make sense. This is one of those stories. We'll call the perpetrator in this account Marcus. That is not his real name. The The crimes described in this story are drawn from documented cases and investigative records, composite in nature to protect victims still living, but faithful in their disturbing particulars. Marcus was 34 years old when the investigation that eventually led to his arrest began. He lived alone in a ground-floor apartment in a mid-sized American city. He worked in building maintenance, a job he had held for nearly 8 years. He was, by every account collected during the investigation, unremarkable. Not beloved, not despised, simply unremarkable. The kind of person you share an elevator with 100 times and still couldn't pick from a lineup. He did not have a criminal record. He did not have a history of violent behavior. He had 2 acquaintances, not friends, acquaintances, who would later describe him to investigators as quiet, occasionally helpful, and impossible to really get to know. The investigation began not with Marcus, but with the complaints of a woman in the building where he worked. We'll call her Diana. Diana had been living in a 3rd-floor apartment in the building for about 2 years when she began to notice things she couldn't explain. Small things, personal things, items moved in her bathroom, a hairbrush that was never where she left it, a window she was certain she had latched that was, on multiple mornings, unlatched. She mentioned these things to her building manager, who assured her that the building was secure, that no one had entered her apartment without her knowledge. He was polite. He was dismissive. This is common in these cases, not because building managers are malicious, but because what Diana was describing sounded, even to herself, like anxiety, like the minor disorientation of daily life. She bought a simple wireless camera and placed it in her living room facing the front door. She didn't tell anyone. For 3 weeks, the footage was unremarkable. She reviewed it every few days, seeing nothing but her own comings and goings, the occasional delivery, the ordinary choreography of her private life. And then, one Tuesday evening, at 11:42 p.m., her front door opened. Diana was not home. She was at her sister's apartment across town. She had decided the previous day to spend the night there, a last-minute decision that she had told no one about. The camera recorded a figure entering her apartment. The figure moved with a familiarity that was immediately viscerally disturbing. Not the cautious, darting movement of someone afraid of being caught, but the easy, unhurried movement of someone who had done this many times before. The figure went to her bedroom. It spent approximately 40 minutes there. The camera did not have a clear angle into the bedroom. When the figure emerged, it was carrying a small bag. It looked around the living room. It straightened a cushion on the couch, actually straightened it as though restoring order before leaving. And then it left. Diana watched this footage alone, at 7 in the morning, still in her pajamas, sitting at her sister's kitchen table. She called the police. When investigators reviewed the footage and enhanced the image, they identified Marcus almost immediately from his building access card records. He had a master key. He had, in the course of his work in building maintenance, memorized the access codes and duplicate keys for every apartment in the building. A warrant was obtained to search his apartment. What investigators found when they entered Marcus's apartment was this. The apartment itself was sparsely furnished. A mattress, a table, a single chair. Almost no personal effects. On the surface, it looked like the apartment of someone who had just moved in, or someone who was about to move out. But then investigators opened what they initially thought was a closet door on the far side of the bedroom. It was not a closet. It opened into a narrow corridor, a maintenance access passage that ran between the walls of several apartments on the ground floor. This type of passage was common in buildings of that era, designed originally to give maintenance workers access to plumbing and electrical conduits without having to enter occupied apartments. Most residents didn't know they existed. The building's current management had forgotten they were there. The doors were supposed to be locked. Marcus had modified his access point. He had removed the original lock and installed a new mechanism, one that could be operated quietly from either side. He had lined the passage with foam paneling to absorb sound. He had installed a small LED strip light, battery-powered, that he could switch on without creating any electrical signature on the building system. And he had been using it for years. The passage connected through a series of small access doors, some of which had been modified, some of which he had created himself through careful, patient work with hand tools over months or years, to the walls of 6 other apartments in the building. He had not been entering apartments only through the front door. He had been watching through the walls. In the maintenance passage, investigators found the record of what Marcus had been doing. There were small holes, each about the diameter of a pencil, drilled at precise intervals into the drywall at points that corresponded to specific locations in each adjacent apartment. Locations that gave a view of living areas, bedrooms, bathrooms. There was a log, a handwritten log, kept in a series of small notebooks. It documented dates, times, the activities of residents, written in the flat, methodical language of someone noting data. Covered a period of nearly 4 years. He had been a systematic, patient observer. He had not always entered apartments physically. Sometimes, apparently, watching was enough. But sometimes it wasn't. Among the items found in the passage were small objects. Items that investigators eventually matched to missing personal items reported by residents over the years. Items they had assumed were simply lost. The investigation expanded. 6 residents were identified as victims. Some had noticed strange things and not reported them, or reported them and been dismissed. Some had noticed nothing at all and were devastated to learn what had happened in their homes, in their most private moments, without their knowledge. Marcus was charged with multiple counts of criminal invasion of privacy, stalking, and unlawful entry. During the psychiatric evaluation that followed his arrest, the evaluating psychologist noted that Marcus did not display the agitation or remorse commonly observed in first-time offenders confronted with the full scope of their crimes. He was cooperative with the evaluation process. He answered questions thoughtfully. When asked directly how long he had planned to continue before he was caught, he considered the question for a long time. And then he said, "I wasn't planning to stop. What makes a person like Marcus?" Investigators and psychologists who examined the case pointed to a particular pattern. A deep, consuming need for control over an environment, for proximity to other people's lives while maintaining total invisibility within them. Not connection, not intimacy in any genuine sense. Observation, possession without contact. The sensation of knowing everything about people who knew nothing about him. In some ways, the most disturbing aspect of the case was its patience. Years. He had done this for years, methodically, carefully, making himself increasingly comfortable in the spaces between other people's walls. Making a home in the gaps of the building structure, present everywhere, visible nowhere. The residents of that building have all since moved. The building itself was eventually demolished as part of a city redevelopment project. The maintenance passages were, at last, bricked over. But the question that Diana asked, the question that kept her awake, that she mentioned in the victim impact statement she submitted to the court, was not, how did he do it? She understood how he did it. The question she asked was, how many times had I felt that something was wrong and talked myself out of it? She didn't know the answer. She said she probably never would. Story 5. Heaven's Gate. Waiting for the ship behind the comet. In the spring of 1997, the Hale-Bopp comet was visible in the night sky. For a few weeks, people all over the world stepped outside after dark and looked up, and saw it. A bright smear of light against the dark, trailing its pale tail across the stars. For most people, it was beautiful. a reminder of how vast the universe is, a reason to feel small in a way that was somehow comforting. For 39 people in a rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California, the comet was something else. It was a signal. It was, they believed, the moment they had been waiting for. Because behind the comet, or accompanying it, or linked to its passage in some cosmic and deliberate way, was a spacecraft. And on that spacecraft were beings of a higher order who had come to take them home. To leave with the spacecraft, they had to leave their bodies behind. Heaven's Gate was founded in the 1970s by two people, Marshall Applewhite, a former music professor and choir director, and Bonnie Nettles, a nurse with a deep interest in astrology and mysticism. They met in 1972 and almost immediately began developing a belief system that was, in retrospect, a remarkable fusion of Christianity, science fiction, and New Age spirituality. They taught that human beings were essentially alien souls, temporary inhabitants of physical vehicles, meaning human bodies, who had come to Earth as part of a cosmic educational program. The physical world was the lowest level of existence. The next level, what Applewhite and Nettles called the next level, was a physical realm, somewhere in the cosmos, inhabited by beings who had graduated from human existence long ago and now existed in a state of perfection. The path to the next level was absolute devotion, absolute renunciation of human desire. Members of Heaven's Gate were expected to give up family, relationships, personal identity, even gender. Several male members voluntarily underwent castration in order to transcend what Applewhite called the mammalian nature of human sexuality. They lived communally. They had schedules, dress codes, identical outfits of black and white. They believed they were preparing themselves, making their vehicles ready for departure. Who were these 39 people? They were, again, not who popular imagination tends to picture when we say the word cult members. They were web designers. Heaven's Gate ran a successful web design business called Higher Source, and their work was professional and technically sophisticated. They were former teachers, former students, former military personnel. They had families outside the group who would, years later, describe their loved ones as intelligent, curious, searching. Many had come to Heaven's Gate after periods of personal upheaval, divorce, loss, a sense that the conventional world had failed them or that they had failed it. They were people who had gone looking for something transcendent and had found Applewhite, who told them with absolute conviction that he was the second coming of Jesus, that he had been given a mission, and that they had been chosen to complete it with him. Bonnie Nettles died in 1985. Applewhite was devastated but incorporated her death into the theology. She had graduated to the next level ahead of them, he said. She was there waiting. Over the following decade, the group shrank and drifted. Members came and went. Some left and rebuilt their lives. Some had left years before the final events. At least 2 former members have spoken publicly about the experience, about how much sense it made, from the inside, about how the community and the certainty and the structure of their days had filled something in them that nothing else had managed to fill. One former member has said, "I don't think I was stupid. I think I was lonely in a very specific way." And they offered an answer to that loneliness that I desperately wanted to be true. In March of 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet reached its closest approach to Earth, Applewhite told his followers it was time. Over a period of 3 days, March 24th, 25th, and 26th, the 39 members of Heaven's Gate carried out what they called their exit. They drank a mixture of phenobarbital mixed with applesauce or pudding. They drank vodka alongside it. They then lay down on their beds or cots and pulled purple shrouds over themselves. They did this in shifts. The first group drank the mixture and died. The second group then arranged the shrouds over them and drank the mixture themselves. A third group arranged the shrouds over the second and followed. They helped each other. They did not die in fear. They did not die in confusion. They believed, with complete and total sincerity, that they were shedding their vehicles and ascending to the spacecraft they had been told was there, waiting. When a former member, one who had left the group months earlier and was therefore alive, went to the house after receiving a farewell package mailed to him, he called 911. The authorities arrived to find 39 bodies, each wearing an identical black outfit, each wearing brand new Nike sneakers, each with a $5 bill and 3/4 in their pockets. Exit fare, Applewhite had told them, for the journey. Marshall Applewhite was among the dead. He had gone with them. Unlike many cult leaders, Applewhite does not appear to have been purely cynical. He appears to have believed what he taught. His video recordings from the weeks before the mass death, recordings he left as exit statements for posterity, show a man who is not performing. He appears calm, resolved, even gentle. He believed. And because he believed, with that particular quality of absolute, unshakable, radiating certainty that some people possess, others believed alongside him. The Heaven's Gate website still exists, maintained by surviving members who left the group before 1997. It states, in plain text, that the group has left this world. It invites visitors to consider the possibility that they were right. The families of those who died at Rancho Santa Fe have spent the years since then in a kind of grief without a clean name, because their loved ones were not murdered in the traditional sense. They were not coerced in the traditional sense. They made a choice, informed in their own framework, deliberate. But were they free to make it? Could a choice made within a belief system so thoroughly constructed by another person, a system that had redefined the meaning of life, death, body, soul, love, and reality itself, really be called free? That question has no easy answer. But it is, perhaps, the question at the heart of every cult story ever told. Because what a cult ultimately does is not simply tell you what to believe. It tells you how to think. It gets inside the mechanism, the way your mind processes reality, and quietly, patiently, lovingly rewires it. And then the beliefs that result feel like your own. They feel like the truest things you have ever known. Story 6. The Patient Watcher, A Killer's Long Game. Some of the most disturbing crimes in modern history were committed not in moments of explosive violence, but across months or years, methodically, quietly, by people who understood, with a kind of terrible patience, that the most dangerous predator is the one that no one sees. This final story is about that kind of patience. We've drawn from several documented cases and investigations to construct this account. The name of the perpetrator has been changed. The investigative details are accurate to the record. His name was Daniel. Daniel was 41 years old. He lived in a comfortable house in a quiet residential neighborhood in a northern European country. He was employed as a secondary school teacher, mathematics and science. He had been at the same school for 11 years. He was, by all accounts from colleagues, well-liked. A little reserved, perhaps, but patient with students. Organized. Professional. He had a wife. They had been married for 9 years. He had 2 children from that marriage. A daughter, 8, and a son, 6. By all accounts, he was a present and engaged father. He attended school events. He coached his son's football team on weekends. He helped his daughter with her homework in the evenings. The investigation that eventually revealed what Daniel was began with something very small. A woman, a retired librarian living alone, 3 streets from Daniel's house, reported to police that her cat had gone missing. This was not, in itself, a police matter, and the officer who took the call was courteous but offered little. Missing pets happen. 2 weeks later, she called again. Her garden had been disturbed. A section of her fence had been cut, near the back, in a way that looked deliberate. And she had found, near the cut, a small item she couldn't identify. a tiny wireless sensor of the kind used in home security or motion detection systems. This time, the officer who came was more attentive. The sensor was logged and sent for analysis. It was a commercial product, easily available, used in DIY home security setups. But it was configured in an unusual way. It was set to transmit rather than receive. It wasn't monitoring the woman's garden for intruders. It was monitoring the garden of the house behind hers. The house behind hers belonged to a family. A woman, recently separated from her husband, with a teenage daughter. Police began a quiet inquiry. During that inquiry, speaking to neighbors and local shopkeepers, they collected a piece of information that seemed initially unrelated. A neighbor mentioned having seen a man over the past several months in different locations around the neighborhood at unusual hours, walking slowly, sometimes stopping. The neighbor had assumed he was simply a local with insomnia or someone who enjoyed late walks. The neighbor, who was a school parent, recognized him when shown a photograph. It was Daniel. The investigation that followed lasted 4 months and involved surveillance of Daniel himself. Investigators were careful. They wanted to understand the full scope of what he was doing before they moved. What they found, accumulated piece by piece, was a picture of systematic, long-running predatory surveillance. Daniel had, over a period of approximately 3 years, placed sensors, cameras, and listening devices in or near at least 7 properties in his neighborhood. Some were placed in gardens. Some, in 2 cases, appeared to have been placed inside properties during periods when the residents were away, possibly during break-ins that had never been reported because the residents hadn't noticed anything missing. The targets had a pattern. They were all women living alone or women in households without male partners. They ranged in age from 19 to 67. He had a recording system in his home, a dedicated hard drive array carefully labeled that stored footage and audio going back 2.5 years. 2.5 years of other people's private lives. Recorded, cataloged, organized. But it was what else investigators found that elevated the case from deeply disturbing to something investigators struggled to fully articulate in their reports. Daniel had notebooks, not 1 or 2, 17, each dedicated to a specific target, each containing detailed notes on routines, relationships, habits. And in each notebook, toward the back, a section he had labeled, in his neat, teacher's handwriting, next steps. The next steps sections described, in careful, methodical language, plans for escalation. For most targets, the notes were observational, noting opportunities for closer access, ways to move from external monitoring to something more proximate. For 3 of the targets, the plans had progressed further, much further. Investigators found that Daniel had, on multiple occasions over the past 18 months, entered 2 of the properties during times when he had determined, from his surveillance, that the occupant was in deep sleep. He had not harmed anyone, not physically, but he had been there, in their homes, while they slept, standing in their hallways, their kitchens. The 3rd target's notebook was different from the others. The next steps section was more detailed, more specific. It described a timeline. The timeline extended to a date approximately 6 weeks from when investigators found the notebook. Daniel was arrested on a Thursday morning at his school between his morning classes. He did not resist. He was cooperative. During the initial interview, he answered questions calmly, precisely, and without apparent distress. When shown the notebooks, his own notebooks with his own handwriting, he did not deny them. He explained them, calmly, methodically, as though he were explaining a mathematical proof to a particularly slow student. He said that he had always been interested in systems, in understanding how things worked. He said that people were systems, that if you observed them carefully enough, for long enough, you could understand them completely. and that understanding them completely was, for him, deeply satisfying. He said, "I never hurt anyone." When the investigator pointed to the third notebook, to the timeline, Daniel looked at it for a long time. He said, "That was a plan, not a certainty. I make plans for everything. I don't always follow them." His wife, when informed of what had been found, was initially certain there had been a mistake. She described him as a gentle man, careful man. She said he had never raised his voice in their house. He had never been violent. He had never given her any reason at all, to be afraid. And then she was told about the hard drive array, about the 7 neighbors, about the notebooks. She asked one question according to the officer who broke the news. She asked, "Did he ever film me?" The answer was no. Daniel had, apparently, maintained a strict division between his family life and what he called, in the notebooks, his project. That fact may have been meant to be reassuring. It was not. Daniel was charged with multiple counts of criminal surveillance, unlawful entry, and possessing devices for the purpose of recording private individuals without consent. He was also charged, based on the third notebook, with preparatory acts related to a planned offense against a person. A rarely used charge that prosecutors argued was justified given the specificity and timeline of what had been found. He received a significant custodial sentence. The 7 women whose lives he had surveilled received notification of what had been found. Each was offered counseling support. Each was given access to legal assistance if they wished to pursue civil claims. Most of them had never met Daniel. None of them had ever spoken to him. He had selected them entirely based on proximity and opportunity. The woman in the notebook with the timeline, the third target, was informed last. She was 28 years old. She had lived in her apartment for 2 years. She had moved there from another city for a new job. She had made a point of choosing a quiet, safe-seeming neighborhood. When she was told what had been found, when she was shown, gently, carefully, the relevant sections of the notebook, she sat in silence for a long time. And then she said, "He didn't know me at all. He watched me for a year, and he didn't know anything about me." Investigators weren't sure what to say to that. She said, "I want him to know that. I want him to understand that whatever he thought he was watching, whatever he thought he was collecting, it wasn't me. It was a window. He was just watching a window." That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about this kind of predator. They do not actually see the people they target. They see projections, objects, systems to be understood and controlled. The surveillance is not ultimately about the person being surveilled. It is about the watcher's need for control, for proximity, for the illusion of power over something that cannot, will not acknowledge their existence. It is a profound and violent failure of empathy, sustained over years. And the people it is done to, the people who have their privacy violated, their lives catalogued, their private moments recorded without their knowledge, they are not the subject of these men's obsession. They are the proof of its absence.